Hi, my name is Callista. I'm 19, living with my mom, Evelyn, and my stepfather, Rhys. On the surface, our situation seems ordinary, a blended family navigating life under one roof, but the story I'm about to share is anything but typical. It's a tale of confusion, forbidden emotions, and fragile boundaries that I never thought I'd have to confront. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon. The golden light filtered through my curtains as I lay on my bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of my thoughts. I had just gone through a breakup with my boyfriend Lucas, and the loneliness weighed on me like an anchor. I was restless, emotional, and yearning for something I couldn't quite define. My room was my sanctuary, filled with my paintings, a soft playlist humming in the background. It was the one place where I felt at ease. Mom was out running errands, leaving just Rhys and me at home. Rhys was a good man, patient, supportive, and kind. He had been a steady presence in my life since he married Mom 3 years ago, but lately there was something in the way he looked at me. His glances lingered just a little too long, his tone carried a warmth that felt deeper than it should. I told myself I was imagining it, but that day, everything changed. I was lost in thought, lying back on my bed, letting the music carry me away. The door creaked open, and before I had time to react, Rhys stepped into the room. "Callista," he said, his voice calm but curious. "What are you doing?" I froze, caught off guard by his sudden presence. My heart raced as I scrambled to sit up, clutching a nearby throw blanket. Just relaxing," I said, trying to sound casual. Rhys's eyes swept the room, lingering on the unfinished painting by my window. You seemed lost in thought," he remarked, leaning against the doorframe. I nodded, swallowing hard. "It's been a rough week." He stepped further into the room, concern etched on his face. "Your breakup with Lucas?" "Yeah," I admitted, letting out a shaky sigh. "I just feel empty." Rhys hesitated, his expression softening. "Breakups are hard, but you'll get through it, Callista. You're stronger than you think." His words were kind, comforting even, but there was something in the way he said them that made my pulse quicken. As he turned to leave, I acted on impulse. Reaching out, I touched his hand. "Rhys, wait," I said, my voice trembling. He paused, looking back at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. Before I could stop myself, I leaned in and kissed him. It was quick, tentative, and filled with desperation. Rhys pulled back almost immediately, his eyes wide with shock. "Callista, what are you doing?" he asked, his tone a mix of panic and disbelief. "I don't know," I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. I feel so alone." He stepped back, shaking his head. "This isn't right. We can't. Your mom—" "I'm sorry," I said quickly, my voice breaking. "I wasn't thinking." Rhys didn't say another word. He left the room, closing the door softly behind him, leaving me alone with the weight of what I had just done. The next morning, I tried to act like nothing had happened. I joined Rhys at the breakfast table, where we sipped coffee in awkward silence. The tension between us was palpable, but neither of us addressed it. As the days passed, I found myself stealing glances at him, trying to decipher his thoughts. I could feel his eyes on me too, watching, wondering, but always with restraint. One afternoon, while Mom was out again, Rhys and I ended up in the living room together. I was sketching on the couch, trying to focus on anything but him. "What are you working on?" he asked, breaking the silence. I glanced up, holding up my sketchbook, just something inspired by yesterday's sunset. Rhys moved closer, sitting beside me. His shoulder brushed against mine, sending a jolt of electricity through me. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice low and sincere. Our eyes met, and for a moment the world seemed to fade away. His gaze was intense, filled with emotions neither of us could name. "Callista," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Yes?" I whispered, my heart pounding. I can't stop thinking about... He trailed off, his words hanging in the air. Before he could finish, I leaned in, capturing his lips with mine. This time, he didn't pull away. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, but it quickly deepened. His hands found their way to my waist, pulling me closer, and I melted into him. The warmth of his touch, the urgency of his kiss. It was intoxicating. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathless. Rhys stared at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of desire and guilt. "This is dangerous," he said, his voice strained. "I know," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "But it feels right." Rhys took a deep breath, his hand running through his hair as he stood up, pacing the living room. I stayed seated, my heart racing as I watched him wrestle with his emotions. "This can't happen," he said finally, his voice firm but tinged with an edge of regret. "Callista, We can't." I stood, closing the distance between us, my hands trembling as I reached out to touch his arm. "Rhys, I know it's wrong, but you feel it too, don't you?" He turned to look at me, his expression conflicted. "It doesn't matter how I feel," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This will destroy everything." I nodded, tears threatening to spill. "I don't want to ruin anything. I don't know how to stop feeling this way." He reached out, his hand brushing against my cheek in a gesture that felt both tender and heartbreaking. "You're so young, Callista. You have your whole life ahead of you. This isn't the path for you." "And what about you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What do you feel?" His silence spoke volumes. The room felt impossibly quiet, the weight of our unspoken emotions suffocating. Then, without warning, he closed the distance between us, pulling me into his arms. The kiss that followed was desperate, filled with all the emotions we had been trying to suppress. His hands cupped my face, his lips claiming mine with a fervor that left me breathless. I felt myself melting into him, the world around us disappearing as we gave in to the pull between us. But just as quickly as it began, he pulled away, his breathing ragged. "We need to stop," he said, his voice strained. "This can't happen again." I nodded, though every fiber of my being screamed in protest. "Okay?" I whispered, stepping back and wrapping my arms around myself. The days that followed were a blur of stolen glances and unspoken words. Rhys kept his distance, throwing himself into work, while I tried to focus on my art. But no matter how hard we tried to pretend otherwise, the tension between us was undeniable. One evening, while Mom was out at a late meeting, I found Rhys in the backyard, sitting by the fire pit. The soft glow of the flames illuminated his face, and he looked up as I approached. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his tone gentle. I shook my head, taking a seat behind him. "You?" He let out a soft chuckle, staring into the fire. "What's on my mind?" We sat in silence for a while, the crackling of the fire the only sound. Finally, I broke the silence. "Rhys, I can't keep pretending this isn't happening. I can't just ignore what I feel." He turned to look at me, his eyes filled with sadness. "Callista, you deserve so much more than this. More than me." "Stop saying that," I said, my voice breaking. "You're everything to me." Before he could respond, I leaned in, capturing his lips with mine. This time there was no hesitation. He kissed me back, his hands tangling in my hair as he pulled me closer. The kiss deepened, and I felt his arms wrap around me, anchoring me to him. The warmth of the fire, the cool night air, and the intensity of our connection made everything else fade away. When we finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine. "This is going to destroy us," he murmured, his voice filled with both longing and fear. "Then let it," I replied, my voice steady. "I don't care anymore." The line we had been so careful not to cross was obliterated that night. Our connection grew stronger, our moments together filled with passion and a sense of inevitability. But with every kiss, every touch, came the looming shadow of reality. One afternoon while Mom was out running errands, Rhys and I found ourselves in the kitchen. I was making coffee and he was leaning against the counter, watching me with that same intensity that always made my heart race. "Callista," he said softly, stepping closer. "Yes," I asked, my voice catching in my throat. "I need you to know that this isn't just a fling for me. I care about you, more than I should." I set the coffee pot down, turning to face him. "I know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I feel the same way." He reached out, his hand brushing against my cheek. "But what happens when Evelyn finds out? What happens when everything we've built comes crashing down?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that I didn't want to lose him. "We'll figure it out," I said, stepping closer. "Together." Rhys sighed deeply, his hand lingering on my cheek as if he was trying to commit the moment to memory. "I am terrified, Callista," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't seem to stay away from you." I reached up, placing my hand over his. "Then don't," I replied, my voice steadied despite the storm of emotions swirling inside me. "We'll take it one day at a time." The words hung between us, a fragile promise neither of us was sure we could keep. But in that moment, it felt like enough. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of stolen moments and whispered confessions. We found pockets of time to be together. A quick embrace in the kitchen, a lingering touch as we passed each other in the hallway. Each encounter felt like a secret world we had created when where nothing else mattered but us. But the shadow of reality loomed larger with each passing day. Mom's obliviousness only heightened the tension, her cheerful chatter a stark contrast to the unspoken truth hanging in the air. Every time she mentioned Rhys with affection, guilt gnawed at the edges of my happiness. One evening, as the three of us sat in the living room watching a movie, the weight of it all became too much. Rhys sat beside Mom on the couch, his arm draped casually over her shoulder, while I perched on the armchair across from them. I tried to focus on the screen, but my mind was elsewhere, consumed by the sight of them together. When the movie ended, Mom excused herself to go to bed, leaving Rhys and me alone. The silence between us was heavy, the unspoken words threatening to spill over. "We can't keep doing this," Rhys said suddenly, his voice breaking the stillness. "It's not fair to her." I looked at him, my heart aching. "I know," I said softly, "but what do we do?" He ran a hand through his hair, his expression conflicted. "We either end this or we tell her the truth." The thought of ending things was unbearable, but the idea of telling Mom filled me with dread. "She'd never forgive us," I said, my voice trembling. Rhys nodded, his jaw tightening. "I know, but living like this, it's tearing me apart." The next day, Rhys and I decided to have a serious conversation about our future. We met in the woods behind the house, the secluded spot providing a sense of safety we desperately needed. "I love you, Callista," Rhys said, his voice raw with emotion. "But this isn't sustainable. We have to make a choice." Tears filled my eyes as I nodded. "I love you too, Rhys. But I don't know if I'm strong enough to face what comes next." He stepped closer, taking my hands in his. "You're stronger than you think," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the house in a warm golden light, we decided to tell Mom. My hands shook as I set the dinner table, the weight of what we were about to do pressing down on me. When Mom sat down, her cheerful demeanor made my stomach twist with guilt. Rhys and I exchanged a glance, silently steeling ourselves. "Evelyn," Rhys began, his voice steady but tense. There's something we need to talk to you about." Mom looked between us, her smile faltering. "What is it?" she asked, her tone cautious. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding. "It's about Rhys and me," I said, my voice shaking. We've developed feelings for each other." The room fell silent, the weight of my words crashing down like a thunderclap. Mom stared at us, her expression shifting from confusion to shock, and finally, to betrayal. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rhys reached for her hand, but she pulled away, standing abruptly. "You're telling me that you and my daughter?" Her voice broke, tears welling in her eyes. "Evelyn, it wasn't planned," Rhys said, his voice pleading. "It just happened. But I love her." Mom's face crumpled, and she turned to me. "Callista, how could you do this to me, to our family?" "I'm sorry, Mom," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I never meant to hurt you, but I love him." Her shoulders shook as she let out a ragged sob, her gaze filled with pain. "You've both destroyed everything." The days that followed were a blur of heartbreak and chaos. Mom moved out temporarily, needing space to process what had happened. Rhys and I were left to navigate the fallout, our once secret world now exposed. The weight of our choices bore down on us, but we clung to each other, determined to find a way forward. Slowly, painfully, we began to rebuild, not just our relationship, but the fractured pieces of our lives. Mom eventually returned, though the dynamic between us was forever changed. She set boundaries, making it clear that while she would always love me, she could never fully forgive what had happened. Months turned into years, and though the road was rocky, Rhys and I found a sense of stability. Our love endured, forged in the fire of adversity. We learned to navigate the complexities of our situation, building a life together despite the odds. Looking back, I know our story is one of heartbreak and redemption, of choices made in the throes of passion and the consequences that followed. It's a story that changed us all, leaving scars but also teaching us the resilience of love. And though the journey was far from easy, I wouldn't trade it for anything.